Here we have a sample problem. Ms. Carrington assigned this problem to her math class and asked them to set up either an equation or a proportion in order to solve it. A meal delivery program delivered 60 meals on Thanksgiving Day. 44 of those contained pecan pie, and the others contained a different dessert due to the need to avoid nut and gluten allergies. What percent of the meals delivered did not contain pecan pie? So whenever we approach a problem where we're going to grade student work or evaluate student work, it's best to have worked this out yourself. So, have your key worked out ahead of time for whatever assignment you're giving. One, just to make sure that the problems work out the way that you want them to, but two, so that you have something to compare student answers to. So this particular problem, we're trying to figure out the percent that do not contain pecan pie, but the numbers that they're giving me is actually the numbers that do, right? So they're saying 44 of the 60 meals do contain pecan pie. So it means we're going to have to do some subtraction. So we could go ahead and find the percent of the meals that do contain pecan pie. And then once we do that, then we would just subtract that from 100 when we're done to find the percent that don't, right? Or you could go ahead and do the subtraction first. So you have some choices here on how you do this. So instead of finding the percent and then subtracting from 100%, we could just go ahead and do the subtraction now. Say 60 meals total minus 44 of them with pecan pie means that 16 of the meals do not contain pecan pie. So then that means that you could just use the 16 instead of the 44, and then you wouldn't have to subtract later with your percent. You can do it either way though, so this gives us lots of choices in terms of the way a student might approach this. So if I do the subtraction first, then I can think of this as really asking the question, what percent of 60 meals is 16? Or if you didn't do the subtraction yet, you'd say what percent of 60 is 44. So if that's really what it's asking, if I wanted to use the translation method here, what percent would be my variable? So you can use X, or I'm just going to use P for percent. And then of means multiply. So of 60 means I would multiply that by 60. And is 16 means that equals 16. So this is one way I could set up this problem with the translation method. So what I would do then is look at, in this case, my student work and look for any that look like that. And you don't necessarily have to solve this, but it wouldn't hurt to do that. If I wanted to solve the equation that I've just written here, I would actually divide both sides by 60. So I would do 16 divided by 60, which actually gets you 0.26, and that 6 repeats. So that keeps going. And then to find your answer, you'd actually have to convert that to a percent. So you'd have to move the decimal 2 spaces or multiply that by 100. And that would give you, depending on what you want to round to, say 26.7%. So that's the answer that I would be getting. If we hadn't done the subtraction at the beginning, then we would have been saying what percent of 60 is 44. And so then we would have done it the same way. It would have been P times 60, but instead of equal 16, it would have equaled 44. So if you do that, divide both sides by 60 there, you get 0.73 repeating. And then again, once you multiply that by 100 or move the decimal 2 spaces, same thing, you're going to get 73.3%. And then you just have to remember to subtract that from 100, right? Since we're trying to find the percent that does not contain pecan pie, this is saying 73.3% does contain pecan pie. So we do 100 minus 73.3% and get the 26.7%. So these are a couple of choices here that we have using the translation method. So I'm gonna keep in mind that I should be getting 26.7% as my answer. But I've kind of got rectangles here right now around those two possible ways of doing this problem. So just going to kind of look through them and look to see if I see any that look like that. So for right now, I haven't solved this yet with the proportion method. So I'm going to skip any that kind of, you can tell these are proportions. So I'm going to skip those for now. And I'm just going to look for ones that look like the translation method. So this one, does that look like either of the ones that I've just written? And it looks actually really similar to this one. Now they've got 1600 instead of 16. And so, that's a little strange. Like, well, where did they get 1600? But if you think about this, if I were to divide both sides of this equation by 60, this would be 1600 divided by 60 would actually give me the same answer. It would give me the 26.7%. So like, why are they doing that? Well, when we did this, we divided both sides by 60, and then that gave us like the 0.26 repeating, right? And then we had to multiply that by 100. So we were doing 16, dividing that by 60, and then multiplying that by 100. Here, they've kind of done 16 times 100, and then divide it by 60, right? That's how you would solve this one. So really, all they've done is just by multiplying by 100 here, instead of waiting to multiply by 100, they've gone ahead and converted it from a decimal to a percent. So it's really the same thing. It's just they've already done that multiplication by 100 part. So I'm going to circle that one because that one absolutely works. It's basically the same thing. They've just already done that. So I'm not going to get a decimal answer. I'm going to get right to a percent. Which other ones look like that? So I'm going to kind of skip the proportion ones. This one also looks really similar. So again, the difference here is that they've got 0.6 instead of 16, but we know 0.6, that's really the same thing as 60%. Now, I'm not really finding 60%, but if we go ahead and solve this, divide both sides by 0.6, 16 divided by 0.6 is the 26.7% again. So if you get the same answer, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's right. But if you don't get the same answer, you know that method's not going to work, right? Or if you don't get an answer that would lead you to the correct answer. But this one, again, like here, they've got 16 and then divide that by 0.6. Well, 0.6 is really the same thing as 60 divided by 100. So really, they've done the same thing again, right? So you can think of this 60 divided by 100 is really 6/10 or 0.6. So it's like this has already been divided by 100. So if I were to divide this by 0.6, I'm technically multiplying them. So again, they're really doing the same thing. It looks a little weird and kind of like, well, how did they get it? But really, they've just already factored in the fact that they have to convert it to a percent when they're done, right? So this one does work as well. All right, so let's see. We've also got this one. So that one's got a 44 in it. So that looks more like this one. So is it the same? So again, just a quick check would be, solve this thing. Divide both sides by 6/10. 44 divided by 0.6 is going to be 73.3 repeating. And this isn't the correct answer, but remember, that's just doing it this other way. You would do the subtraction at the end. So once they would get 73.3 repeating, then they would just subtract that from 100% to get the answer, to get the 26.7%. So again, it's the same thing. They've just already converted it to a percent instead of leaving the answer as a decimal. So that one works as well. Let's see. I think this one kind of looks like translation, maybe. That might come from actually proportion method. So that might be something to revisit later. But again, we could go ahead and solve it, and if we get the same answer, then that means it's possibly correct. If I don't get the same answer, though, I could just rule it out. So if I do 60 times 100, that's going to give me 6,000. And then if I divide both sides by 44, 6,000 divided by 44 is 136.36 repeating. So 136, that's not the right answer, and it's not leading me to the right answer either. So I could probably go ahead and rule that one out. Again, we could revisit it later after we do the proportion method, but yeah, the fact that I'm not getting a right answer or something that leads me to a right answer means that one's not likely working. All right, so we could also solve this problem with the proportion method, and that's one of the other two methods that we went through in the notes. So again, this problem, we're trying to find what percent out of the 60 meals is the 44, or you went ahead and did the subtraction, is the 16, right? The 16 meals that were not pecan pie. So if I were to set this up with proportion, the method that we used is we do the is over of equals the percent over 100. So in this case, I don't know what the percent is, so I would, use an X or a P, or honestly, you could leave it as a percent sign. Like you could do all kinds of things there. So whatever variable you want to use, I'll use P for percent. And then the is part is 16. And then what is it out of? It's out of 60 meals. So this would be another correct way to do this is I could actually cross multiply or whatever method you like to use to solve that proportion. But I would really just look for, do we have any of these proportion method ones that look like that, right? And so I am seeing, let's see, there's this one right here. So that one has 16 over 100 equals x over 44. So that one's a little weird. It's got the 16 and the 44. So that looks a little different. And then, again, you could solve it and see if you get the same thing. If you do, it doesn't necessarily mean it's right, but if you don't, it's definitely not. So if I were to cross multiply the one I came up with, I would do 1600 divided by 60 in order to solve that for P. And again, you get 26.7%. So this one, though, if I cross multiply this, 16 times 44 is 704. And then that would be equal to 100x. And then divide both sides by 100, you're getting 7.04, which is not the right answer, and it's not leading us to the right answer. So this one definitely does not look the same as what we have. What about this one? So they've got 100 over D equals 60 over 60 minus 44. So they've got 60 minus 44 in here, but we know 60 minus 44, that's really 16. So, they just didn't do that subtraction yet, which is fine. So they've got really 100 over D equals 60 over 16. Does that look like what we have? Well, it looks like it's kind of flipped, right? So instead of P over 100, they've got 100 over D. So they've like flip-flopped those and they've used D instead of P. And then as long as they've also flip-flopped these, right, and kept that consistent. So instead of 16 over 60, they should have 60 over 16. That absolutely works, right? And I would get the same thing when I cross multiply. I'd get 1600 equals 60D and solve that. So this one absolutely does work. All right, so then what other ones here? So I'm noticing a lot of these proportion ones, they have 44s in them instead of 16s, which is fine. That just means that instead of using the subtraction first, they're counting on doing that subtraction later. So instead of doing what percent of 60 is 16, they're doing what percent of 60 is 44, what percent actually is pecan pie. So if I were to set that up with a proportion, it would look the same as what I've written over here, except instead of 16, I'll use 44. So 44 would be the is part out of 60 meals, and then I'm trying to find the percent out of 100. So this would be another correct way to set it up. It's just when I solve this one, I'm going to get 60p equals 4,400. And then when you divide both sides by 60, you're going to get the 70 73.3%, right? And so then again, you just have to remember to subtract that from 100%. So this would be another correct way. It's just you're doing the subtraction at the end. So do I have any that look like that? All these ones that have 44s in them. So actually, this one looks exactly like that. They just use X instead of P, but other than that, it looks exactly the same as what I have there. So that looks great. This one, so it looks like they've swapped places with their 60 and their P, right? So is that okay? That should be okay. Now, it's a little weird, but as long as we get the same answer when we cross multiply, and we would get 4,400 equals 60p, then that should work. So, they've kind of just, instead of putting their percent, like 100% with the percent they're trying to find on the top, they've put it next to it, right? So they basically got like the parts over on the left and the wholes over on the right. So they're saying like, okay, the whole is 100% and the whole number of meals is 60 meals. And then we're trying to find what part is that percent, right? So what smaller percent is that part? And then this is the part that is pecan pie, right? So the whole is 60 meals or 100%. The part is the number of meals that had pecan pie or the percent that I'm trying to find. So it works. They're just in a little bit different place, but they keep it consistent. So that is a correct way to set this up. All right, let's see. What about, let's see, this one also had 44 in it, but it's also got 16 in it. So that's a little weird, right? Like 16 is the part, right? So that should be out of the whole, but instead they've got it over this other part, right? So, and if you were to cross multiply that, we're not getting the same thing. We're getting 1600 equals 44p. So if we do 1600 divided by 44, that's 36.36 repeating. And that is not either 26.7% or the 73.3%. So I think they could have fixed that pretty easily if they had made this 60, right? We could say the percent over 100 is 16 out of 60 meals, right? And that would match this one actually. So really, they just needed that to be 60 instead of 44. So that one does not work. Let's go to this one. So that one, does that look like either of them I have? So it looks kind of similar to this one over here. Is it consistent? It's not. So they flipped the 60 and the 16, which you can do that. You can switch those two as long as you also switch them over here, but they didn't switch them over here. So they left the X over 100. So yeah, if I cross multiply on that one, I'm not getting the same answer. So that one does not work. So let's see, I have just a couple left here. I had mentioned this one, we already crossed it out, but I had mentioned this one. This one, you could have gotten from cross multiplication. So, for example, if we had like 60 over X equals 44 over 100, if they had set up a proportion like that and then cross multiplied, that would have given you 60 times 100 equals 44x, which is what they have here, right? So it's almost as if they started with this proportion and went here. Is this proportion correct? It's not, right? So this does not match the proportions that we have. So again, we ruled it out already, but this is further evidence that that one is not set up correctly because that proportion is not correct. So then let's see, what about this one? So 16 over 60 equals X over 100. Absolutely, that is exactly the same as this one. So it's just they've used X instead of P, but it is otherwise correct. So that one looks great. And then I've kind of avoided this one because it looks a little funky, right? This first one here looks a little funky. And I think we've either circled or crossed out all the other ones. So what about that one? Well, we could first just check and see, do we get the same answer? Because if we don't, then we can rule it out. If we do, it doesn't necessarily make it right, but there's a good chance it might be right. So if we do 44 divided by 60, you get 0.73 repeating. And then if you multiply that by 100, you get 73.3 repeating. So you get the 73.3%, and then we could subtract that from 100. So it looks like we're getting the same answer. If you think about this, what they're really doing is they're really taking this fraction and changing that fraction to a decimal. And that fraction kind of makes sense. That fraction is actually this fraction that we came up with, right? 44 out of 60 meals contain pecan pie. So it's really just taking the number of pecan pie meals and expressing that as a fraction out of all the meals total, right? So if we think of the whole as being all 60 meals, 44 out of 60 is the fraction that are pecan pie meals. And so if you change that to a decimal, like I said, you get the 0.73 repeating. And then if you want to change a decimal to a percent, what do? You multiply it by 100. And so that's what they've done here. So yeah, this absolutely works. And you could really relate it back to the proportion method or the translation method. So if you think about this version, right? What would we do if you wanted to? You could think of this like 44 over 60. You could go ahead and find that decimal, right? So one way you could solve this proportion instead of cross multiplying is to go ahead and get that as a decimal. And so you'd have 0.73 equals P over 100. And then how would you solve that for P? You would multiply both sides of that by 100. And so that's what they've done here. So it really comes from this proportion. They've just solved it a different way other than cross multiplying. So this is in general just some, way to go about this is, start with how would you do it? What are some different ways that you can work through it so that you can kind of compare yours to student answers? And then you just kind of do them one by one, process of elimination, and look at them and see how they look the same, how they look different. And certainly if they don't get the same answer or don't lead you to the same answer, you can rule them out.